The night was supposed to belong to celebration, but instead it opened with a question that cut through the winter air. How did a war fought hundreds of kilometers away suddenly switch off the lights of Russia's most protected city? As fireworks were meant to mark the turn of the year, coordinated Ukrainian strikes were already unfolding, aimed not at symbolism, but at systems, energy, logistics, confidence. Earlier, Russian forces had launched a massive wave of drones toward Ukrainian cities, targeting power plants and substations in a familiar attempt to freeze infrastructure and morale at once. The logic was old: darkness breaks resistance. Yet within hours, the narrative flipped. As Russian television broadcast carefully staged speeches about unity and control, a different reality crept across Moscow's neighborhoods. Streetlights blinked out. Apartment blocks fell silent. Elevators stalled between floors. What had been framed as a distant special operation abruptly entered the private space of ordinary citizens. This was not a frontline report. It was a domestic shock. For the first time in months, the war was no longer something watched on screens. It was something felt in frozen rooms and dark stairwells. The blackout was not merely inconvenient. In winter, electricity in Russia is inseparable from survival. Heating systems depend on powered pumps. Without them, radiators cool rapidly and indoor temperatures plunge. Within hours, thousands of households in the wider Moscow region were reduced to candles and blankets. The scale mattered. This was not a single district or a technical hiccup, but a widespread failure affecting hundreds of thousands. The message was unmistakable. Even the political and economic heart of the country was vulnerable. Financial systems followed the lights into silence. Internet disruptions cascaded into digital banking failures, leaving payment terminals useless and mobile apps unresponsive. In a society pushed rapidly toward cashless transactions, plastic cards suddenly became meaningless. People queued at ATMs not out of habit, but fear, only to discover quiet restrictions already in place. Withdrawals were capped. Access to personal savings was throttled. Officially, nothing was wrong. In practice, panic was being managed through limits, not reassurance. This moment exposed a contradiction at the core of Russia's wartime economy. Publicly, the state projected resilience and growth. Privately, it prepared for loss of trust. Restrictions on cash hinted at deeper concerns. Authorities anticipated stress on the banking system if confidence cracked. The blackout did not just turn off power. It illuminated how fragile the balance had become between narrative and reality. Beyond Moscow, similar patterns emerged. Regional grids flickered. Transport systems slowed. The war's scale was no longer measured only in kilometers gained or lost at the front, but in megawatts, minutes, and missed paychecks. Strategically, this shift mattered. Ukraine's approach signaled a widening campaign from battlefield attrition to economic pressure, designed to strain the Russian state from within. For NATO planners and Western analysts, the implications were immediate. Infrastructure warfare was no longer confined to Ukrainian territory. As dawn approached, lights gradually returned to parts of the city, but something else stayed: dark certainty. If Moscow could be plunged into silence once, what prevented it from happening again? And if this was only the opening signal, what targets would come next in a conflict increasingly defined by energy, economics, and endurance, rather than trenches alone? When electricity fades in a modern city, panic does not arrive all at once. It spreads in layers. First comes confusion, then calculation, and finally fear. As Moscow's blackout deepened, the most immediate concern was not politics or geopolitics, but warmth. In countless apartment blocks, heating pumps fell silent, and radiators that had been hot minutes earlier turned cold to the touch. Outside, temperatures hovered well below freezing. Inside, families began sealing doors, piling on clothing, and improvising ways to preserve heat, fully aware that Russian winters do not forgive delays. The scale of disruption quickly revealed why energy infrastructure has become a central battlefield in this war. Electricity is not simply light, it is circulation. Without it, water systems slow, mobile networks degrade, and emergency services operate under strain. Elevators trapped residents between floors, particularly in the high-rise buildings that dominate Moscow's outskirts. For elderly residents and families with small children, the blackout became a physical threat rather than an abstract inconvenience. The financial shock followed closely behind. As internet connectivity faltered, digital payment systems collapsed with it. Grocery stores reverted to cash-only transactions, while many cash registers stopped functioning altogether. The rush to ATMs was instinctive, but the outcome was sobering. Withdrawal limits imposed quietly to prevent bank runs meant that many people could not access enough money to cover even short-term needs. Credit card symbols of stability in an urban economy were suddenly useless plastic. This moment cut deeply into public confidence. For years, authorities had promoted digitalization as proof of modernization and resilience, aligning Russia with global financial systems even under sanctions. Yet the blackout revealed the vulnerability of that model. When power fails, digital finance fails faster. The state's response was not transparency, but containment, limiting withdrawals, discouraging speculation, and relying on the hope that outages would be brief enough to avoid mass outrage. From a strategic perspective, this reaction underscored how economic warfare now operates. Ukraine's actions were not aimed at terrorizing civilians, but at testing thresholds how much disruption Russian society could absorb before trust eroded. Western analysts have long noted that modern conflicts increasingly target systems rather than armies alone. Energy finance and logistics form a single chain. Breaking one link strains the rest. NATO military assessments frequently highlight this interconnected vulnerability, particularly in states where centralization amplifies systemic risk. Meanwhile, official messaging remained calm, even dismissive. Local officials described the situation as under control, attributing outages to technical issues while downplaying their scope. Yet on the ground, people compared notes, shared videos, and understood that this was not routine maintenance. The contrast between lived experience and official reassurance widened the credibility gap, a gap that no amount of controlled messaging could fully close. As hours passed, anxiety shifted into something more corrosive: uncertainty. Would power return in minutes, hours, or days? Would heating systems restart smoothly? Or would frozen pipes burst and create longer-term damage? In a city accustomed to predictability, these questions lingered unanswered. The blackout had already done its work by forcing people to imagine worse scenarios. And as households waited in the cold, another realization settled in. If energy and finance could be disrupted so easily, what other pillars of daily life were exposed? Transport, food supply, communications. The fear was not just about that night, it was about the next one. And if this pressure continued, how long could society absorb it before frustration turned into something far more dangerous for the state? The stress test extended beyond apartments and bank queues. It reached the places designed to symbolize mobility and normal life. Airports, usually insulated from domestic disruption, became some of the most visible stages of the crisis. As airspace restrictions tightened and power-related delays cascaded through control systems, departures slowed to a crawl. Arrival boards filled with red warnings. Flights were canceled, diverted, or delayed for hours, then days. Thousands of passengers found themselves stranded not by weather or foreign sanctions, but by failures rooted at home. For many, the airport experience stripped away the last layer of official reassurance. Travelers slept on cold floors surrounded by luggage and unanswered questions. Announcements were vague, sometimes contradictory, often absent. The response offered to passengers was minimal: small food vouchers, limited accommodation, and little clarity about when flights would resume. The message, though unintended, was unmistakable. Endurance was expected, not comfort. In a country that presents itself as a global power, the treatment of its own citizens spoke volumes. This episode revealed a deeper structural issue. Russia's transport network, particularly aviation, relies heavily on centralized systems, power, communications, scheduling platforms. When one element falters, the entire chain stiffens. The war has already strained aviation through parts shortages, reduced routes, and rising maintenance costs. The blackout added another layer of fragility, exposing how little margin for error remains. Western aviation analysts have long warned that sanctions and isolation would gradually erode safety and reliability. This disruption suggested those predictions were no longer theoretical. Economically, the impact rippled outward. Delayed flights meant missed business deals, disrupted supply chains, and lost revenue for airlines already operating under pressure. Tourism, once a modest but steady contributor to urban economies, suffered another blow. Each grounded aircraft represented not just inconvenience, but accumulated financial loss fuel. Wasted crews, idled schedules, scrambled. In wartime accounting, these costs rarely make headlines, but they accumulate quietly, week after week. Strategically, the symbolism mattered as much as the numbers. Airports are gateways, physical reminders of connection to the wider world. When they stall, isolation becomes tangible. For NATO observers and Western policymakers, such scenes reinforce an assessment that Russia's war effort is hollowing out civilian infrastructure to sustain military priorities. Resources flow toward defense, while civilian resilience erodes. This imbalance may sustain combat operations in the short term, but weakens the state's long-term stability. Official statements sought to minimize embarrassment. Spokespeople emphasized safety protocols and temporary disruptions, avoiding any linkage to broader systemic stress. Yet social media told a different story. Videos of crowded terminals, exhausted families, and frustrated travelers circulated widely, undermining attempts to control the narrative. In an age of constant connectivity, even partial outages cannot fully silence public testimony. As the night dragged into morning, stranded passengers began asking a different question, not when their flights would depart, but what this meant for the country as a whole. If transport, energy, and finance could all falter in a single coordinated shock, what remained truly secure? The war had crossed from abstract strategy into lived experience, and it was becoming harder to pretend otherwise. And while passengers waited under flickering lights, another kind of illumination was spreading across Russia's industrial landscape: fires, visible from kilometers away, signaling that the pressure was far from over. If airports revealed vulnerability, what would happen when the economic engine itself was hit next? While airports stalled and cities shivered, a far more consequential drama was unfolding beyond the urban skyline. In multiple regions, flames rose from facilities that formed the backbone of Russia's war economy. Oil depots and refineries, usually far from public view and heavily protected, became targets in a campaign that struck at the logic of endurance itself. These were not symbolic hits. They were calculated blows aimed at fuel, mobility, and money. Facilities in regions such as Kaluga-Krasnodar and deep inside Tatarstan were affected, each playing a specific role in Russia's logistical ecosystem. Some depots feed rail networks that move military equipment westward. Others refine diesel and aviation fuel critical for armored units and air operations linked to fronts in southern and eastern Ukraine. When these sites burn, the impact is not confined to balance sheets. Tanks idle, convoys slow, aircraft face shortages. The battlefield feels the effect days or weeks later, not immediately but relentlessly. This approach reflects a shift toward what Western military analysts describe as strategic attrition. Instead of focusing solely on frontline engagements, Ukraine has increasingly targeted the systems that sustain them. Energy infrastructure sits at the intersection of economics and warfare. Every barrel lost is both revenue denied and capability constrained. For a state whose budget depends heavily on hydrocarbon exports, the implications multiply quickly. Reduced output means reduced cash flow, just as military spending remains elevated. The strike deep into Tatarstan carried particular weight. That region represents the industrial heartland once considered beyond reach. By demonstrating that distance alone no longer guarantees safety, the attacks challenged assumptions underpinning Russian internal security planning. NATO assessments have long emphasized that modern warfare compresses geography. Drones and long-range systems turn depth into illusion. This episode appeared to confirm that analysis in real time. Economically, the timing was damaging. Energy exports remain one of Russia's primary sources of foreign currency, even under sanctions. Disruptions ripple outward into contracts, shipping schedules, and pricing. Each refinery shutdown forces rerouting, temporary imports, or stockpile depletion, all costly measures. Over time, these inefficiencies compound, eroding the financial cushion that buffers the war effort. The psychological dimension was equally potent. Videos of burning tanks and storage facilities circulated widely, accompanied by commentary that mixed grim humor with anger. For citizens already shaken by blackouts and travel chaos, The fires reinforced a sense that stability was slipping. The state's promise that sacrifice would be orderly and controlled looked increasingly hollow against images of uncontrolled destruction. From a Western strategic viewpoint, this phase of the conflict underscores a broader context. NATO's role is indirect but significant, reflected in intelligence sharing, technological support, and doctrinal learning. Ukraine's ability to identify, reach, and disrupt critical nodes speaks to a maturation of capabilities shaped in part by Western cooperation. The result is a pressure campaign that stretches Russian defenses thin, forcing choices between protecting cities, infrastructure, and the front. As smoke drifted over industrial zones, another question surfaced among observers. If energy, the foundation of both civilian life and military power, could be hit repeatedly, how long could Russia sustain the illusion of economic normalcy? The fires were not just burning fuel, they were burning time. And with each blaze, the margin for recovery narrowed further, setting the stage for a confrontation not only of armies but of narratives, endurance, and credibility. As the fires burned and outages lingered, the contrast between official rhetoric and lived reality grew sharper by the hour. On screens, carefully framed speeches spoke of unity, resilience, and progress. Leaders praised sacrifice and insisted the economy was adapting, even strengthening. Off-camera, however, the evidence pointed in another direction, one measured not in slogans, but in shortages, price hikes, and exhaustion. This widening gap between narrative and experience became one of the most destabilizing effects of the crisis. Economically, the strain was no longer abstract. Inflation continued to outpace wages, particularly for essentials such as food, utilities, and transportation. In several regions, electricity and heating bills consumed an alarming share of monthly income, forcing households to borrow simply to stay warm. These pressures were not temporary spikes, but symptoms of a deeper imbalance. As more resources flowed into defense production, civilian sectors struggled with rising costs and shrinking margins. Manufacturing outside the military sphere slowed. Investment dried up. The war economy appeared active yet increasingly hollow. Western economists and institutions have described this pattern before. Growth driven by defense spending can inflate headline figures while masking structural decay. NATO-aligned analyses emphasize that such models sacrifice long-term productivity for short-term output. Skilled labor migrates toward higher-paying military contracts, draining civilian innovation. Inflation accelerates. Central banks respond with high interest rates, further suppressing non-military investment. The cycle feeds itself, narrowing future options. Social consequences followed quickly. Reports of labor shortages clashed with record-low unemployment, a paradox explained by mass mobilization and emigration. Hundreds of thousands of working-age citizens had either left the country or been absorbed into uniform. Many who departed belonged to urban-educated demographics engineers, IT specialists, financial professionals, precisely the groups needed to modernize an economy under strain. Western think tanks have repeatedly warned that this kind of brain drain inflicts damage that takes decades to repair. At the same time, public trust eroded. Stories circulated of missing records, delayed compensation for families of soldiers, and bureaucratic silence. These were not isolated grievances, but cumulative ones, reinforcing a sense that the state's priorities were shifting away from civilian welfare. The blackout and refinery fires served as catalysts, bringing latent frustrations to the surface. Strategically, this internal tension matters as much as any battlefield development. NATO planners understand that wars are rarely decided solely by military outcomes. They hinge on societal endurance. The Kremlin's messaging aimed to preserve that endurance through control and reassurance. Yet each visible contradiction weakened the effort. The more citizens experienced disruption firsthand, the harder it became to sustain belief in official optimism. By the time power returned and flights resumed, the damage had already been done. Confidence once shaken does not reset with the flip of a switch. The question now facing Russia was not whether it could restore order temporarily, but whether it could maintain cohesion under repeated pressure. And as winter continued and the conflict showed no sign of slowing, a more unsettling prospect emerged. What happens if this was not the peak of disruption, but merely a preview of what sustained economic warfare could bring? By the time the immediate crisis faded from headlines, its deeper implications had begun to settle in. The blackout, the airport paralysis, and the refinery fires were not isolated shocks, but interconnected signals of a system under cumulative strain. Together, they illustrated how modern warfare blurs the line between front lines and home fronts, turning energy grids and supply chains into contested terrain. For Russia, this shift carried profound consequences that extended far beyond a single winter night. The most enduring impact lay in perception. For years, stability had been the Kremlin's central promise, a guarantee that regardless of politics or sanctions, daily life would remain predictable. That promise cracked when lights went out in Moscow apartments, and citizens queued unsuccessfully for cash. The realization that no place was entirely insulated from disruption altered the psychological landscape. Fear gave way to resignation, and resignation to quiet anger. This erosion of confidence once embedded is difficult to reverse. From a strategic standpoint, the episode reinforced assessments long held in Western capitals. NATO analysts emphasize that resilience is as critical as firepower. States able to absorb shocks, economic, informational, infrastructural, retain freedom of action. Those that cannot are forced into reactive postures. Ukraine's evolving campaign suggested an understanding of this principle, applying pressure where it multiplied effects rather than merely inflicted damage. The goal was not collapse overnight but sustained imbalance. Economically, the outlook darkened further. Energy revenues, already constrained by sanctions and price caps, faced new uncertainty from infrastructure vulnerability. Repair costs mounted. Insurance premiums rose. Export schedules slipped. Each disruption narrowed fiscal space at a time when military expenditures remained elevated. Western financial experts warned that such conditions risk locking Russia into a cycle of high spending, low productivity, and capital flight, an equation historically associated with stagnation rather than recovery. Socially, the consequences compounded. Emigration accelerated among those with means, and mobility draining skills and ambition. Those who remained confronted higher prices, limited services, and diminishing prospects. The contrast between sacrifice demanded and benefits delivered became harder to justify. Even without overt protest, disengagement itself posed a threat to cohesion. As the war moved deeper into another year, the central question shifted. It was no longer simply whether Russia could win or lose on the battlefield, but whether it could sustain the internal balance required to continue at all. Every outage, every grounded flight, every burning depot chipped away at that balance. The conflict had become a test of endurance measured in years, not weeks. And as observers in the West evaluated these developments, one conclusion grew clearer. The battlefield was expanding faster than any single defense could cover. If pressure continued to rise across energy, finance, and society, how much strain could the system absorb before the cost of persistence outweighed the promise of victory? This story traced how a single coordinated wave of disruptions, blackouts, transport paralysis, and energy strikes revealed vulnerabilities far deeper than temporary inconvenience. What began as a night of darkness in Moscow evolved into a broader portrait of economic strain, social anxiety, and strategic imbalance. Energy infrastructure emerged as the war's hidden frontline, linking civilian life directly to military endurance. Airports and banks exposed how tightly modern systems are woven together, while refinery fires demonstrated how pressure on fuel and revenue reverberates all the way to the battlefield. Looking ahead, the trajectory raises difficult questions. If infrastructure attacks persist and economic pressure compounds, Russia faces not a sudden collapse, but a grinding erosion of resilience. Western analysts warn that such slow attrition is often more decisive than dramatic defeats. The longer the conflict drags on, the harder it becomes to rebuild trust, retain talent, and stabilize finances. So, what comes next? Can the state adapt quickly enough to protect its economic core? Or will each new disruption deepen the cracks already visible? And how long can society endure a war that increasingly reaches into kitchens, wallets, and daily routines? If you found this analysis valuable, share your thoughts in the comments and join the discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for in-depth coverage and clear-eyed analysis as this conflict continues to reshape the global landscape.